So let's dive right in. We got this great question, something I bet a lot of folks bump into when they're starting with AWS SSO, or well, IAM Identity Center now.
hmm
You run also login profile, and then you check your .os credentials file,
Yeah.
and nothing. It's like, wait, didn't I just log in? Where did it go?
Yeah, that's a classic. It feels totally counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
You expect login to mean right credentials here.
Exactly. So our mission today really is to unpack that. Why doesn't it update .os credentials? And, how does the AWS CLI actually handle these SSO logins?
Okay, good plan. And I think the best place to start is probably with a really core AWS concept, the difference between long-term and temporary credentials,
Right. The permanent keys versus the guest pass idea.
pretty much. So .os credentials,
Yeah.
that's traditionally been the home for the long-term stuff.
Yeah.
Think IAM user access keys, the kind you generate, and, well, they just sit there unless you change them.
Or even your root user keys initially, which you hopefully lock away immediately.
Absolutely. Those are designed to not expire. They're static.
Okay, so that's the old way, or at least the way for specific things like IAM users, but also login is different.
Totally different beast. When you run also login, you're specifically asking for temporary security credentials, not long-term ones.
Temporary. Okay, so what does that actually mean in practice? How are they different?
Well, the big one is lifespan. They're short-lived. We're talking minutes, maybe up to 12 hours at the absolute max usually, not months or years.
Wow, okay, so very different from an IAM key that just hangs around.
Exactly. And they're generated dynamically by AWS after you authenticate. They aren't something you create and store yourself in the same way. And crucially, they don't live in that ASO credentials file.
So they include the usual suspects, access key, secret key.
Yep, access key ID, secret access key, but also a third piece, a session token. That token is kind of the proof that this specific temporary session is valid.
Got it. Access key, secret key, session token, temporary, but why? Why go through this, more complex sounding process instead of just using the keys in the credentials file? What's the win?
Security.
Yeah.
It really boils down to security, mostly. There are some major upsides.
Like what?
Well, first off, you don't have to embed long-term super-sensitive keys directly into your code or config files nearly as often. If a temporary key leaks somehow.
The damage is limited because it expires quickly.
Exactly. The window for misuse is tiny compared to a permanent key getting out there. It drastically reduces your risk surface.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Less worry about leaked keys living forever. What else?
It's also fundamental for granting access without creating permanent AWS identities everywhere. Think about IAM roles.
Right, whereas service or user assumes permissions temporarily.
Or identity federation. Using your company login like Okta or Azure AD to get into AWS. You're not getting a permanent AWS user. You're getting temporary credentials based on who you are in your organization.
Okay. So temporary credentials are key for roles in federation too. Better security, more flexibility.
You got it. And this is where AWS IAM Identity Center, the service formerly known as SSO, comes into the picture.
So that's the service generating these temporary credentials for me when I use the CLI.
Precisely. IAM Identity Center is the manager, the central hub for handling access for human users across potentially many AWS accounts. It issues these temporary credentials when you authenticate via the CLI or the console. It's a big shift, really.
A shift away from static keys towards dynamic temporary access.
Exactly. Towards least privilege and time-bound access. It's just a more modern, secure approach.
And you mentioned federation. It works with things like Okta or Azure AD. It's not just an AWS internal thing.
Oh, yeah. Very flexible. You can hook it up to your existing corporate identity provider, whatever that might be. Or you can use AWS itself as the identity source if you don't have one or prefer that. The point is central management.
Okay, cool. So let's walk through it again. I type also login profile, my SSO profile. What happens step by step?
Okay, step one. You need that profile actually set up in your .os config file. Not the credentials file, the config file.
Right, config for configuration, credentials for static keys. Makes sense.
And this profile in config needs specific SO parameters. It needs to know your organization's unique SSO start URL.
That web address thingy.
Yep. And the AWS region where your IAM identity center is set up, the specific AWS account ID you want to access, and the IAM role name you intend to use within that account.
So it's like a little instruction set for the CLI.
Exactly. It tells the CLI, Go here, authenticate, then ask for this role in this account.
Can you give me a quick example of what that looks like in the file?
Sure. It might look something like this. OV's agency staff profile, my SSO profile.
Okay.
SSRTL https.my-company.https, SSRTL https, SSRTL https. So startrel https, SSRTL https, SSRTL https, SSRTL https, SSRTL https, SSRTL https, output, and Jace OSIN. See? You got the SOSA SSO counted, disortal counted, the other region, and output are just standard CLI settings for after you're logged in.
Okay, clear. Profile setup and config. I run the command, then what? Browser time.
Usually, yeah. The CLI will typically pop open your default web browser. It sends you to that SOSA turtle or your linked identity provider's login page.
And I just log in like I normally would. Password, maybe MFA.
Standard web login flow, whatever your company's configured. Once you successfully prove who you are.
IAM Identity Center goes, okay, you're legit.
Right. It verifies you. Then it generates that set of temporary credentials, the access key, secret key, and that all-important session token.
And sends them back to the CLI tool running on my machine.
Securely, yes. They get passed back to the AWS CLI.
And now we get to the main event. Where do those credentials land? Because as we established, it's not .os credentials.
Correct. They land in a special cache directory. It's usually .oso cache.
.oso cache, okay.
Yep. Inside that cache directory, you'll find some JSON files, often named using a hash related to your oso carols. And inside those files, that's where your temporary access key, secret key, and session token are stored.
So credentials for long-term IAM user keys? SoCache for the temporary dynamic IAM Identity Center credentials? That separation makes perfect sense now.
Exactly. Keeps things neat and tidy and respects the different life cycles of the credentials.
Okay, that clears up the core mystery, but you mentioned something about simplifying this. SSO sessions.
Ah, yes. Good point. So managing lots of those individual profiles in the config file, especially if you access many accounts or roles, can get a bit repetitive. You'd be typing the same ASO star turtle and so region over and over.
Yeah, I can see that being annoying and maybe error-prone.
Right. So the AWS CLI has this handy command, osconfigure ASO, that's like a wizard to help set things up.
A setup wizard, okay.
One key thing it does is help you create an ASO section in your ASO config. Think of it like a template for your organization's connection.
A template. How does that work?
You define the common stuff, the SAW turtle, the SAW region, just once in this named ASO session block. Then your individual profiles, like Profile My Dev Account or Profile My Prod Account, instead of listing the URL and region themselves, they just point to that name session using your session name.
Oh, I see. So you define the connection details once, give it a name.
Like My Company So or something.
And then each profile just says, use the My Company So connection, and I want this account ID and this role.
It's exactly. It makes the config file much cleaner, much easier to manage. Let me show you an example. You might have any SSO session, My Company So region US1, SOSRELRO, https://my-company.asapps.com/start. Sorters registration scopes, SSO registration scopes, SSO registration scopes, ISO. From Airfile Dev Admin, SSO registration scopes, ISO. SOTA registration scopes, ISO. SOTA registration scopes, ISO. SSO counted 11 MoMA 22222333. SOTA registration scopes, SOTA name admin role. SOTA registration scopes, admin role. SOTA registration scopes is SO. SOTA registration scopes, SO. Profile prod reveille. SOTA registration scopes, SO. SOTA registration scopes, SO. SO registration scopes, SO. SO registration scopes in the SO. Southwest Store region, SSO registration scopes, SO. See how both Dev Admin and Prod Readily just reference SO session, My Company So, no need to repeat the URL or region.
That is much nicer, way less repetition. So easier config is one benefit. Are there others to using these sessions?
Yes, a really big one, automatic token refreshing.
Tell me more about that. Does that mean I don't have to run OS, so log in constantly?
Pretty much. When you log in initially, besides the short-lived access token, the one that might last an hour, the CLI also gets a longer-lived refresh token as part of that SSO session setup.
Okay, a refresh token.
So when your main access token expires after, say, an hour, the CLI can automatically, behind the scenes, use that refresh token to talk to IAM Identity Center and get a new set of temporary credentials, access key, secret key, session token.
Without me doing anything. Without opening the browser again.
Correct. As long as the underlying SSO session defined by the refresh token is still valid, the CLI handles it for you. It makes for a much smoother workflow, especially if you're running longer tasks.
That's huge. That explains why I can often work for most of the day after just one login in the morning.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Simplified config, automatic refresh, and obviously reusability across many profiles is the recommended way to set things up for IAM Identity Center access.
It really seems like a much more grown-up way to handle AWS credentials compared to scattering static keys around.
It definitely is. More secure, more manageable, especially at scale.
Now, about those session lengths, you said temporary credentials might last minutes to hours. Is there a fixed time, or can it be controlled? How long does that refresh capability last?
Good question. So the duration of the overall session, how long you can keep refreshing before needing to do a full browser reauthentication, is configurable by AWS administrators.
Ah, so my admin sets that.
Yes. Within IAM Identity Center, they configure it on the permission sets, which are linked to the roles you assume. They can set a maximum session duration, typically from 1 hour up to 12 hours.
So even with the automatic refresh, there's still a limit. Maybe once a day I'll have to log in properly again.
Correct. That maximum duration ensures you still have to periodically reauthenticate fully, which is another security checkpoint, and make sure your access is actively revalidated.
Right, makes sense. Don't want sessions lasting indefinitely, even with refresh tokens. Okay, I think this paints a really clear picture now.
Great.
The reason also login doesn't touch .os credentials is because it's dealing with a whole different system. IAM Identity Center generating temporary credentials. And those temporary credentials live in their own dedicated spot. Apahosa cache managed via profiles in .os config, ideally using those nice SSO session blocks for easy management and auto-refreshing.
That's the core of it, yeah. It's about moving away from the risks of static, long-lived keys towards a more secure, centrally managed temporary access model.
It definitely streamlines things once you understand the flow, especially across multiple accounts. Log in once via the browser, maybe once a day, and the CLI handles keeping you going.
Precisely. It's designed to be both more secure and more convenient in the long run.
Okay, fantastic explanation. It really clarifies that initial point of confusion. So, wrapping up, it kind of makes you think, doesn't it?
So,
Well, knowing that AWS is pushing this temporary credential model so hard via IAM Identity Center for better security, it begs the question, where else in our cloud setups could we benefit from this idea? Using short-lived credentials and automating rotation instead of relying on static keys.
that's a really interesting thought. Like for applications running on EC2, or maybe CI/CD pipelines accessing resources.
Exactly. Are we still using long-lived keys in those places where maybe we could adopt a more dynamic temporary approach? Something definitely worth mulling over for anyone listening.
Absolutely. Food for thought on improving security posture across the board.